Welcome back to the Morn Moan Grave yet again, my friends. And today we're diving the deepest we've ever dove before. So, with that being said, join me for part 4. Oh hey dude. Welcome in, everyone, to part 4 of the DLC Weapon Frame Data Analysis. And today, we have a really exciting one for everyone, and that, of course, is no less than the Dueling Shield itself. So, with that being said, let's jump right in to analyzing the frame data sets for this Dueling Shield. So, we have the one-handed neutral R1 here. And when I pull this up, you guys can clearly see that this is very interesting. It actually does have guard frames activating about halfway through its active attack frames, okay? And this is just the one-handed neutral R1, and this weapon's frame data keeps getting crazier and crazier as we go on down the line, as you will see. But just analyzing this, the one-handed neutral R1 here, and of course this is in the main hand, is on frame 16, which is very akin to something like a CGS, for example, a curved greatsword neutral R1, right? So it's similar in speed there. But once again, just going back into the guard in the recovery frames that this attack has here is very interesting, and that it's going to honestly, just the way that this weapon's set up is so fascinating, because of course we have had, if you guys are familiar with Dark Souls 3's DLCs, we've had a weapon called Valorheart, right, which was a paired short sword and shield weapon, right? And what that had, and how they designed that, was it had guard startup frames at the beginning, right? So that is really interesting that they're kind of reversing the design philosophy here, and instead of it happening at the start, they backloaded it effectively, right? So once again, you know, when you throw this attack out there, you're going to potentially, you know, be open to being interrupted at the startup of the respective attack here, but as soon as it gets about halfway through, once again, the active attack frames, you're going to have that guard frames kicking in all the way into your move recovery, okay? So it covers literally everything past the active attack frames here. So we got the fast weapon art you can go into fast goods, you can go into left attack, your dodge. So this is crazy too, because it protects you all the way up until your dodge recovery, right? So this weapon's going to be very safe, if I had to guess, right? So there's that, right, with the baseline neutral R1 here. And one other thing that is very interesting too is that the guard recovery is one of the slowest, you know, barring the move recovery here. And you can actually, the guard frames last well into the guard recovery, or the guard cancel recovery as well. So you could just be sitting pretty there for a while after you throw out this attack, and you're going to be able to go straight into guarding again, you know? And of course, we'll see how that ends up shaping up when we get into the two-handed moveset and the two-handed R1s and R2s and all of the other augmented attacks therein. And being able to block just with this weapon while two-handing it is going to be a very nice piece of utility as well. And one other thing, I guess, before we move on to the rest of the moveset, because some of the stuff that this weapon has going on for it, guys, is absolutely crazy, alright? But here we actually do see that it has disable block stun associated with it. So what this means precisely is that when, like, for example, when you're using a shield in your offhand, right, and you're just blocking, and you're blocking, you know, attacks in PvE or PvP, respectively, and, you know, your character kind of, like, intakes that stun animation of, you know, being hit by the attack that is being guarded. And that is what is known as block stun, right? So what we're seeing here, this flag being disable block stun, so that means that during the attack frames, when the guard actually kicks in, it's going to disable that block stun like pushback animation where you can't really do anything. So if a person hits your shield during the guarding frames there, you will not be like pushed back or like interrupted effectively, is what that means. And what another thing that this means too is that the disable block stun not only does that, but it also means that you cannot be guard broken during the attacks, dude. So during the guard frames, you literally will go into negative stamina instead of actually being guard broken, which is, it's absolutely wild, right? So yeah, all of these things kind of stacking up, and once again, this is just the tip of the iceberg thus far with how potentially this weapon type's functionality is going to work like. So that being said, we can kind of get into the baseline R1 follow-ups in the chain, and right, we do see R1 number 2, R1 3, and R1 4, and R1 4 of course being the chain finisher here. But looking into R1 2, this is where it starts getting really interesting too, right? So you see how far this guard, the block frames extend into the recovery, right? All the way well into the move recovery. And then this is interesting, right? So it's the same speed in terms of where the actual active frames come out, but the active frames did get extended by, I believe, 1 frame. Okay, and this is kind of like a reoccurring theme, right? It maintains this kind of 4-frame active hitbox here, which is really, really cool. But that aside, you can kind of see how the first R1 has the guard very, very backloaded. And then the follow-up R1 has immediate frame 1 startup of block and the guard for 4 frames right there, frame 1 through frame 4. So what this means is that you're going to be able to like effectively pseudo parry people with the R1 chains, right? It's not like a parry in a traditional sense, right? But what I mean when I say that is you're going to be able to throw out the neutral R1, right? And then you're going to have guard frames, you know, and well into the recoveries of everything. And then if your opponent pushes in to try and like, you know, interrupt you or strafe you or something like that, or go for like a running attack, you can immediately go into your follow-up R1 and then effectively perfect block that incoming attack, and then with this frame 1 through 4 guard right here, and then immediately answer back and potentially even like counter hit them with the follow-up R1, right? And once again, going into the attack frames here, because we have that front loaded, you know, like small portion of active guarding, you know, at the startup of the animation, and then it goes away, right? But then it kicks back in once again in the latter half of the active hitbox, which is really, really interesting, but it's only for a minute amount of time. It's only 2 frames, right? So you kind of have this like this split guard, you know, activation here, which I think is really, really cool. And there's going to be a lot of like outplayability options in a PvP setting with this, and even in a PvE setting, honestly, too. Just being able to time all of these attacks properly to be like, haha, checkmate, dude, I got you, you know, with the immediate guard frame startup of 1 through 4 on the follow-up R1s, right? So with that being said, and once again, for the follow-up R1 here, you'll notice that the guard doesn't extend into the recovery anymore, right? So these follow-up R1s in the chains are going to be a little bit more risky because, once again, you don't have full protection well into pretty much every single one of your recoveries that come afterward, right? Like you would with the first R1. So once again, I'm really digging this design, right? Because it's like you front load this, you're protected for the first one, but you don't have any, or you backload it rather, you know, for the first one, but you don't have any on startup. But then it's kind of like this give and take, right? So if you do the follow up, then you have immediate guard frames on front loaded, you know, but a very minute amount, but then, you know, they kick in a little bit later, but then you're vulnerable for the entire recovery effectively of R1 number 2 if you decide to go for it, right? So it's just, it's so cool, dude, that they're playing around with all of these different things. And once again, the disable block stun is applied to these smaller portions of the guard as well, which is definitely worth pointing out. But yeah, with that being said, before we hop into R13 here, if you'll allow me a quick sip of water, dude. All right, so going on from that, we're moving into one-handed R1 number 3 right here, okay? And this is where it gets really interesting too, because, and once again, this is the one-handed R1 chain, right? And you kind of see like a repeat in how they're actually designing this, and it's really, really cool. So you have the backloaded guard frames right here on R1 number 1, you have the early startup on R1 number 2, and then it kicks in for, you know, 2 frames here during the active hitbox. Then R1 number 3 kicks in, and it's effectively nearly a 1-to-1 repeat of the neutral R1, the first one that comes out in the chain, and then you have the backloaded guard recovery again, right? And it makes up for what you lost and what you gained in R1 number 2 in the chain. So that is just, it's so cool, dude, right? So once again, not really too much to say about that because it is almost like 1-to-1, like a carbon copy of the first R1 in the chain. But once again, it's that repeat dynamic going back and forth there. But then what's really interesting is after the backloaded guard, you know, frames in through all of the recoveries here, for R1 number 3, we have the chain finisher. And the chain finisher, obviously the active frames kick in a little bit later, of course, because, you know, chain finishers being the biggest hits of their respective chains, right? I guess one thing before we jump into R1 number 4 is that it's worth noting that they're nearly identical, R1 number 1 and R1 number 3, except R1 number 3 has the attack frames kicking in 1 frame faster than the initial. Obviously the initial has frame 16 and this has frame 15, so it's a little bit faster there, which is quite cool, right? But yeah, R1 number 4, and once again, this repeat pattern, it's nearly a 1-to-1 of R1 number 2 in the chain, except as you can see, it's a blending of R1 number 2 and R1 number 1, right? So not only do you have an extension, you have an extra 2 frames of guard frames on startup, so it's 6 frames of guard on startup of the final chain finisher here, but it's a little bit slower of an attack. But then you notice that it actually has guard frames in through the vast majority of its recovery, right? So it's this really cool dynamic back and forth in design between guard frames on startup, guard frames in recovery, guard frames on startup, and then a hybridize in between, you know, like that's so cool conceptually. So yeah, like this is kind of what we're working with the Dueling Shield, okay? So with that being said, that is the one-handed R1 chain right there. Very, very interesting, obviously. Very, very cool. And then we actually do see the one-handed running R1 here, which is on frame 18, respectively, there. So pretty decent, you know, startup, pretty well telegraphed attack. I imagine this is going to have a lot of forward momentum tied to it. And as we see here, you know, like with the design of the shield itself, once again, I just want to say the gold, like, adornments and everything that this has with, like, the red wood, dude. It's so cool. Such a sick design. And, of course, the insignia in the center, whatever that is, I'm not quite sure. But just incredible. But what I really wanted to point out here, right, is once again, the wide base where you actually grab onto it with the bar that's attached on the underside here, right? It's very, very cool, but once again, these spikes, right? And these are really, really, really cool. And I imagine, and we do see this, the character using the shield in more of a thrusting-like manner, and maybe potentially like the follow-ups are going to be mixed with like bashing attacks, etc. You know what I mean? Or like a slash where you just hit somebody with like the fucking side of the spike, right? So who knows? But more than likely, this weapon is going to be oriented around poking, more than likely, right? And we do see that actually in this clip right here. We actually do see the two-handed neutral R1, and that being actually a, you know, thrusting based attack, right? So once again, that kind of reinforces the idea that the vast majority of this weapon's attacks are going to be able to make use of counter damage and counter hits. So Spear Talisman potentially going to be very brutal with this weapon in general, right? But of course, we will get to the two-handed moveset when we get to it. But with that being said, you know, just kind of reinforcing the fact that maybe this one-handed running R1 is going to be like a, you know, like a running charge with like a thrust, you know, like the pointy end of the shield, right? So that's definitely interesting. Frame 18, it's by no means like unreactable or anything like that. Very reactable, but if it has a lot of forward momentum, it's still going to be very, very useful, especially, you know, if you're, you know, force trading with this or something like that, right? But once again, you see the reoccurring theme where, you know, you have the disable block stun, and you have guard frames kicking in about halfway through the overall active frames of this attack too. And what I do want to point out too, going back into like the R1 chains, like these are relatively meaty hitboxes, you know what I mean? Like four active frames for the active portion of a hitbox, you know, where its hitbox is actually active. That's really, really good, you know, like four frames and up is extremely good, you know? So that's definitely worth mentioning there, but that is the running attack design for the one-handed moveset. And here's where it starts to get crazy, right? So we'll keep up the one-handed running R1. It's kind of basic, you know, just falling in line with like the neutral R1 that we already saw, kind of similar in design, you know, the guard frames kicking in about halfway through the active attack frames, etc., as I've already stated, right? But the running R2 is where it gets really fascinating, dude. Okay, so as you can see right here, we see for pretty much the first time a like middle portion of the guard frames being utilized right here, about midway through the overall animation itself. And this is a very, very like long animation, you know what I mean? Like your dodge recovery is at frame 58, which you know, you don't really see that outside of like Ashes of War typically, you know what I mean? So, or like a running R2 attack from, you know, like a Great Spear, for example. Like that's another really long-winded animation. So with that being said, like the structure of this running R2 is so cool to me, because not only does it have these midway activation of the guard frames, you know what I mean? But this also points towards it just like you're gonna be like you're gonna be like running at your opponent, dude, with your like shield held up in front of you, sprinting at them. You pull up the shield, like you're holding it in front of you, and then you're sprinting at them potentially throughout this entire duration of these frames, and then you do like you set the shield down, or you like cock it back, and then you make like a leap forward or something, and then you just like jump at them with the active frames, right? So this to me, and once again, this mix-up wise is so crazy good too, because it's like the synergy between the one-handed running R1 and the one-handed running R2 is just that, like, okay, if they expect, you know, if they start like breaking your animation, because this is a relatively, you know, like long startup for a running R1, you know, if they're interrupting this a bunch, then, you know, you can start weaving in the one-handed running R2 and be like, oh, you can't interrupt me anymore at the timing that you had been doing for the running R1, because I'm in block frames now, and then potentially they're gonna panic roll after they hit the guard frames on the running R2, and then you're gonna set the shield, you know, like out from in front of you, and then do like a massive leap forward and like maybe roll catch them, right? So I really like to speculate as to what this move set, or this move in particular, is going to look like, because it's so cool in terms of design and how crazy they're getting with these attacks conceptually, right? They're really thinking about it, right? So I just wanted to point that out, kind of the useful differences between the running R1 and the running R2. And I wish that FromSoft would have went a little bit I don't know, I wish they would have used this kind of dynamic more within the baseline weapons in Elden Ring, right? Because it's like one-handed, you know, like running R1s, or just running R1s in general, in comparison to running R2s, they're not really all that different functionally. It's like, oh, the running R2 is just, you know, it has more impact and it's a little bit slower than the running R1, right? And it's like, yeah, that's fine, you know, but I really want to see like massive mechanical shifting differences and making a strong differentiation between what is considered a running R2 and what is considered a running R1. And this weapon definitely showcases that, probably better than any other frame data set that we currently are able to get our hands on, you know. So yeah, that's kind of the breakdown with the difference and discrepancies between the two running attacks of the one-handed moveset, of course. So we do actually see here, as we're moving into the one-handed rolling R1, which is very interesting too. And once again, a very similar design as to like the neutral R1, you know, but one thing that is worth pointing out here is that the rolling R1, and by association, of course, the crouching R1 is frame 15, which is not bad, you know, like by any means, especially if you start, you know, utilizing turnaround blending and crouch blending and wave dashing, etc., you know, with this rolling R1 and crouching attack. It's potentially going to be really good, you know, because you can shave off a lot of this startup here, especially, you know, because there's certain crouching attacks and rolling attacks that start from your character actually being in like a lower center mass, like closer to the ground. So especially if it has like a startup animation like that, it's going to be really easy to blend. But it's by no means going to be like equivalent to like Power Stance Great Spear, you know what I mean, or like pre-nerf Gugs poking, right? But it's still going to be a nice mix-up option, and I really like that it's just, you know, it's a little bit faster. It's that one frame faster than the neutral R1, and you're gonna have some decent mix-up potential there, you know, and I appreciate that. So that's the rolling and crouching R1 right there. And if I remember right, the backstep attacks on this thing are really cool too, dude. So check this out, okay? And once again, this is kind of a blending like we saw with R1 number 4, the chain finisher, except it takes the guard frames from more so towards the middle of the animation, and it's not immediate guard frame startup. So this is really, really cool, dude, and it kind of mimics the running R2 with kind of like that middle of the animation guard frames there. And once again, five frame guard startup is like, it's so fast, dude. So just because it's not like frame 1 or something like that, don't let that discourage you from like utilizing an attack like this. Because once again, you know, like backstep attacks are largely underutilized, just because once again we don't have iframes on backsteps like, you know, Dark Souls 2 had, for example. You know, we don't have hyper armor on backsteps like we used to have in Dark Souls 1. I mean, the Darkwood Grain Ring, for example, the one that changed your rolling and backstep animations, that actually gave you iframes on your backstep in Dark Souls 1, right? So the current iteration of what we have on backsteps in Elden Ring is very, very underwhelming, you know? But one thing that I will say, and a lot of people don't know this, right? And I feel like this is a really good time to mention this, that this actually does exist and is a mechanic in Elden Ring, is that in Dark Souls 2, they added a mechanic that allowed you to maintain your guard. Like, you could keep your guard held up with like a shield or when you're two-handing a weapon while backstepping, okay? So, like, for example, you know, like in Elden Ring, right, they actually retained that system from Dark Souls 2 that they implemented. So you can actually maintain your guard the entire time while backstepping, and that actually makes backstepping a really useful tool, you know, because it's like you're still traveling the a similar distance as you would be if you're rolling, but if you're using something like a great shield or a two-handed weapon like a colossal sword or something like that that has really good two-handed block defenses and a decently high stability rate, it's like that's a pretty good like avoidance option, you know, that we don't really see all that often, especially in a PvP setting. But now that that's been established, right, that does exist, it's like, and seeing the design of the backstep attack on the Dueling Shield here, frame data wise, it creates a really interesting dynamic, especially when we go and look at the two-handed moveset, because once again, when you're two-handing the Dueling Shield, you're going to be able to block with it with the L1 button, right? So once again, when you take that into account, the fact that you can block backstep, and you have a backstep attack with guard frames that activate on frame 5, and then, once again, this is a very similar kind of design to the running Arsu, where this is kind of mid-loaded, and then you see a significant gap here. But then, if you look at the running R2, it doesn't have guard frames in its recovery, right? It only has them right here, about in the middle of the animation, but there's still this similar gap. But with the backstep R1, you have it on frame 5, very similar activation there, a little bit faster than the running R2 even, and then you have this pretty significant break here, and then on frame 23, the attack frames come out, and potentially you're going to be jumping forward, because a lot of backstep attacks have a tremendous amount of forward momentum tied to them, because of course, you know, conceptually, you have to actually make up all of that distance that you're backstepping away from your opponent with the incoming attack. And FromSoft has done a very good job with, you know, making those attacks have a lot of forward momentum. So I don't think it's too unrealistic to assume that this attack would have a very similar thing attached to it as well, right? So you have the guard immediately. You potentially block the incoming attack during the activation of this animation, and then you put your shield down or off to the side, and then you rear up for like a massive like jump forward or lunging based attack, and that's where the active frames kick in. But then in the recovery too of this backstep R1, you have guard frames well into and way past even all of your dodge recoveries here. So that's really, really, really cool. So I apologize if I'm spending too much time on something like a backstep attack, but you know, like the reason why I do so is just because I want backstepping to be something that is more usable, you know, especially in a PvP setting. And when I see an attack like this with this kind of structure, with the guard frames and stuff like that, and working in tandem with the system that I talked about earlier with block backstepping being in the game, you know, it's like you can really start, you know, theory crafting and start weaving this kind of stuff together and be like, wow, like you might be able to do things with this weapon that you literally just cannot do with anything else in the game that exists currently. And once again, that's what makes analyzing this frame data so exciting, dude. You know, it's like, of course, granted, a lot of this stuff may not be like one-to-one exactly what we're getting in the DLC, but it gives us a good basis and foundation as to speculating about it, right? So that is the one-handed backstab R1, of course, here. So moving on from that, we do have the one-handed R2 #1 release here. Okay, and we'll pull up the charge window for this as well. Let's see here. Okay, so I guess we'll look over the fully charged variant first, right? And this is just a fully charged R2, the one-handed fully charged R2. Okay, so this is actually, and we're seeing this starting from when you actually input the attack. So all of this blank space that we're seeing from frame 1 to frame 7, this is where you charge up the initial animation, right? And then, of course, you have 7 frames until you actually have guard kicking in, dude, right? So you actually do have block frames during the charged window of an R2 attack, dude. So like this is crazy. Like this, as far as I know, maybe barring like the one-handed and two-handed great shield movesets, or maybe even one and two-handed baseline shields when it's in your like main hand, right? Those movesets may have something akin to this, but if that is the case, that is the only example of something like this existing in the game currently, as far as I'm privy to, at least, right? But just kind of honing in on that even more, being able to have guard frames during the charge up of a respective animation is so incredibly cool, and I love that as a design so much, because once again, the problem with the vast majority of charged attacks in the game, right, is just that, for one, they don't have a fast enough release window, right? And we'll look into the release window here in a second, right, to actually like reliably roll catch people, you know, as kind of like a 50-50 scenario. But that, on top of the fact that there's not a lot of like forward momentum typically tied to fully charged attacks in Elden Ring 2. And don't get me wrong, there are some examples of really good fully charged attacks in the game, like the Tree Spear R2s, for example, like Arumi, right, the Sword Whip, right, and like the Godskin Stitcher, for example. You know, they have that like kind of double hit and a lot of forward momentum tied to them, right? So you have not only like a frame trap scenario, but you also have the ability to actually catch people rolling away from you, right? So that aside, though, we have guard frames in the charge window, and they last a really long time until the actual release. And now is a good time to actually look into the release here. And once again, we are seeing the tail end of the guard frames here. So you can count the last 3 frames here. So frame 33 to frame 36 right here. Okay, and that's what we're actually seeing right here, frame 1 through 3, right? And this is the release window for it, right? And once again, this applies to both the fully charged and the uncharged, if I'm not mistaken here. Feel free to correct me in the comments if that is not the case, but I do believe that that is what we're looking at here. So once again, if we look at this in the release window in particular, we can see that on release of the R2 button, or the right trigger button, whichever you're on controller wise, of course, you actually do retain that 1 to 3 frames of guard, so you can actually reaction release and still have that minuscule amount of, you know, 3 frame portion of being able to actually block an incoming attack on the release window, dude, too. So not only do you have block frames on the charge window, right, and the uncharged window, you retain 1 to 3 frames. So if you get really good at timing this, the release of this R2 attack, you're going to be able to block the incoming attack and potentially catch them in recovery with a potentially counter hit if this is a thrusting based attack, because once again, as we went over and we saw here, we do see the two-handed neutral R1 being a thrusting based attack, which of course is going to have the ability to counter hit too, right? So this is insane, dude. Like, the outplay ability tied within this weapon, just within the few attacks that we've seen thus far and how their functionality seems to go, it's like, dude, this is so cool, right? And once again, it allows you to perform and pull off things that literally don't exist within the game right now, you know? So this weapon type is going to be such a shakeup, dude. And I welcome that, and I think that's so exciting, right? But once again, the release to the active frames, frame 13 it's kind of like, it's normalized, you know what I mean? It's kind of similar to like a great weapons release window, you know, and where it actually comes in contact with your opponent. So frame 13, it's a little bit on the slower side, all things considered, but you're still going to be able to, you know, pull off some really cool interactions and land this attack, you know, with like a force trade where you're guarding all of that up front, you're gonna block, you know, everything, and then you're just gonna be able to answer back with a massive counter hit, dude. And I love it. I love it. So without me ranting too much more about the R2 functionality, we should keep it rolling here. Let's take a look at the one-handed charged follow-up R2 window here and compare that to the charged window of the first attack. So this is charged R2 number 2 in the chain, so the follow-up here, and this is of course number 1. So the activation of the guard frames are a little bit quicker here at frame 7 on the one-handed charged R2, and then it looks like the guard frames kick in on frame 11, which is still relatively fast, all things considered, right here, right? And they last a really long time. We actually see this animation as being very similar in terms of speed overall, right, to the first R2, but it's just really realistically the only discrepancy here is very the follow-up R2 has way more active guard frames than the alternative from the first charged R2 there. So that's really interesting as well. Oh, and I'm actually I just recognized this. So here, okay, this actually this clarifies a few things here, okay? So I forgot to mention this right here, okay? So this is the release to uncharged window, so that really gives us a way better idea as to where this is actually happening at, right? So once again, even if you just buffer the attack and you're not holding it at all, the release to uncharged, once again, you know, frame 12 to frame 29, so keep that in mind there, and that actually gives us a better idea as to what we're seeing when it comes to the 1 to 3 or 1 through 3 active frames of guarding at the release window once again. So definitely do keep that in mind, right? But yes, that is the R1 number 2, or R2 number 2 rather, sorry about that. And then we'll look at the the one-handed R2 number 2. So the follow-up, once again, we're looking at the second R2 fully charged right here and how many active guard frames it has, which is absolutely insane, right? But then we see the release window with the follow-up R2 right here, and look at this, look at how crazy that is, dude. Frame 1 guard activation, and it lasts all the way to frame 13 to the activation of the active hitbox, dude. So when you put both of these together, you know, like you look at the the release window of the first R2, you know, and then you go into the follow-up attack recovery, right? And then you go into the follow-up R2, and you have immediate guard frames from frame 1 to frame 13, lasting all the way up until the attack itself goes out, dude. Like, that is so crazy. So you're effectively impervious, you know, to frontal cone based attacks, you know, with these guard frames well into your active attack hitbox. So that is just so incredible there, dude. Like, my word. And once again, what I do want to point out is, like, when you look at the recovery from the active the end of the active hitbox frames, so frame 17 to frame 30, right? So 13, that is very significant recovery, you know. So it's not like these R2s are going to be free by any means or something like that. You're going to be able to like spam them, right? But once again, there's just a lot of, you know, once again, going back to how the neutral R1 follow-ups are working, it's kind of like that pseudo parry kind of play style, right? So it's like somebody goes in after your first R2, and then you're like, nope, you fucked up, and now I'm in, you know, disable block stun, can't be guard broken, etc. They can put you into negative stamina, and that's probably going to be one of the biggest drawbacks to this weapon, right? And you're going to want to run this weapon presumably with a very high endurance build. Probably I would recommend like at least in the 40 area, you know what I mean, for endurance. But that aside, dude, let's start moving into the rest of the moveset here. Okay, so this is where it gets absolutely crazy, dude, too, because like, remember how I said at the start of the video that this is just the tip of the iceberg, dude, and I've already spent so long just talking about the one-handed moveset alone, right? And now we're getting to the exciting stuff. It has Barbaric Roar and Warcry associated with it frame data wise. So what that means is not only does it confirm that this weapon has an unlocked Ash, which is so exciting, right? And also, this has been corroborated by the recent information that dropped about 3 or 4 days ago at this point, you know, with the new gameplay and the folks who got to play the game a little bit early, a walled off section for 3 hours. They also did confirm in that the Dueling Shield did have an unlocked Ash as well. So it proves that, you know, the Barbaric Roar and the Warcry is not like it's locked Ash too, because that was always a possibility before, leading up to this, you know, before we had confirmation from the folks that actually messed around with it and played with it. But yeah, dude. And once again, these animations to this form of Barbaric Roar and the Warcry is, I do believe it is in line with the Halberd variant. So obviously the Halberd variant of Barbaric Roar is not all that great, but you know what is great, the Halberd variant of, is the Warcry variant. And the Warcry animation on Halberds, and obviously we have confirmation of now after looking into this particular Barbaric Roar and Warcry animation set, is the Halberd Warcry, dude. Which when you put like Warcry on the Knight Rider glaive, for example, or something like that, and you're stacking the off Highland axe and the Roar medallion and stuff like that, if you get like a counter hit, you're regularly hitting people for like upwards of 900 damage, and that's without a counter hit, dude. So, and being that, once again, that this weapon is shaping up to have a lot of thrusting based attacks, and this animation, the R2 in particular on Warcry, is a thrusting based animation, Warcry is going to go incredibly hard with the Dueling Shield, dude, and that is so exciting. But yeah, so the confirmation of the locked Ash and having the beautiful, absolutely pristine Warcry animation is so cool, dude. All right, so moving on from that, we actually can look at the one-handed guard counter too, which I was when I was watching through the impressions videos of people that played around with the Dueling Shield, they mentioned that the guard counters go incredibly hard with the Dueling Shield, which it only makes sense too. You know what I mean? It's literally an entire weapon based around using a shield as an offensive tool, right? So you would expect that the guard counters are going to be really, really sick. And obviously, this animation, we get a little bit of a interesting idea as to how it's going to work here, and even the guard counters themselves have block frames in the recovery as well, which is a really, really, really cool idea. But of course, the one-handed guard counter is a little bit more niche because you need to have like a blocking tool in your offhand to be able to utilize this one. But the two-handed guard counter is where, you know, it's going to get a little bit more interesting, because once again, you're going to be able to block with the L1 button whilst two-handing this weapon, right? So mixing and weaving is going to be really, really fascinating there, but not too much to break down here, other than the fact that it is, you know, it has this reoccurring theme, you know, with the guard frames and recovery there. So with that being said too, we do move on to the one-handed jumping R1s, which is very, very interesting here. We see a frame 13 jumping R1, which is very fast. This is the fastest animation that we've seen tied to, at the very least, the one-handed moveset at this point. So the Dueling Shield is going to have really good aerial pressure and aerial aggression, right? So, and once again, as a jumping attack enjoyer myself here, I'm very pleased to see that and find that out. So that's definitely interesting. And once again, we're going off of the landing frame data here, so do keep that in mind, because once again, if we were to pull up like the this, right, it's you know, this is all of the other jargon as to how they actually had to code the buffered input, right, while you're in the air and all of that. But that's part of the reason why we look at the landing R1 specifically, because it gives us a better idea as to, you know, it has the appropriate recoveries attached, etc., right? So that's definitely interesting, and obviously this has a very, very low dodge recovery, and once again, all of the recovery and things like that are very, very subject to change, so I would take those with a grain of salt, but as it stands right now, and once again, we're looking at the 1.7 variant of this weapon, so it likely has been tweaked quite a bit. But that aside, just going based off of this is very, very low recovery. So like frame 17 up to frame 22 is the dodge cancel window, so only 5 frames of recovery there. So that's absolutely wild, right? But once again, you know, pointing out, it does have guard frames, you know, that start up in the last frame of the active attack hitbox. So this is a very, very safe jumping attack, probably one of the safest jumping attacks that exists in the game currently, because the guard activates immediately as you know, finish the active attack frames, you know, and then lasts well into the dodge recovery and nearly every other recovery that exists, right? So that's definitely fascinating to see that this weapon is going to have a really good jumping attack, at least one-handed. And then we got the one-handed jumping R2, which is interesting as well. The jumping R2 is only frame 15, which is equivalent, I do believe, to like a Shamshir jumping R2, for example, in terms of speed. I could be wrong about that, but I do believe that that's similar in frame data speed there. But once again, you know, the guard coverage, they're running out a little bit quicker, and doesn't actually last into the move recovery as we have traditionally seen at this point thus far. And also, moving on from that, we actually do see that this weapon has the ability of riposting and backstabbing too. So that is extremely exciting, dude. Shoutouts to the homie Wazoos, dude. The perfect block backstab god, dude. And I know he's a really good friend of mine, dude, and he is so looking forward to this weapon, dude. It's like they made it just for him, bro. So yeah, definitely on that front, you know, I know when I showed him about this, or told him about this rather, he was just over the moon. You know, because that was always the biggest concern with these new weapon types, is it's like, how are they gonna create brand new animations for these specific, you know, like weapon types, all of these weird, awkward, like new things that they've never done before. But obviously this is confirmation that they're going the extra mile, right? So that's definitely really exciting as well. And now, my friends, for the probably the single most exciting part about this weapon, because this is where it gets absolutely wild. So before we dive into the two-handed moveset here, I am going to get a quick sip of water, and then we'll dive right in. All right. So this is wild. So this is the two-handed neutral R1 that we're seeing right here, and check this out, right? Because this is the attack, presumably, that we're seeing, right? Is the two-handed neutral R1 from the player character right here. So you do see that, you know, the startup, they kind of like rear up with the shield, they like hold it in front of themselves, and then they lunge forward a little bit with that kind of like thrusting, and then they pull up into the top left there, which is very cool, right? And so the fact that we're seeing this on display here is really awesome. And obviously we do get to see what the two-handed block animation looks like afterward too, which is cool. And it's worth noting too, because what we're seeing here is not disable block stun. So the disable block stun is only happening during the block frames of the actual attack portion of the attack itself, right? So, or into the recovery portion of the attack, respectively, okay? So the reason why the character's getting like pushed back here by the boss is strictly because they are out of the active block frames of the attack animation and the recovery animation, and they're just opting to hold down L1 afterward, after performing the first neutral R1 there, and that is why the block stun is kicking in. But so there's that, dude, which is very cool. And then obviously we do see a very interesting thing happening here, and this is what is very fascinating too, right? Because this is obviously the normal like guard and what it looks like with the Dueling Shield, holding it kind of just straight up and down, like vertical, right? And I think that's, first and foremost, that's so cool, right? But what's interesting here, and I don't think a lot of people caught this, is I think what we're seeing when the character takes the side stance again, is I think this is probably the startup of the two-handed R2, where you're, and once again, from what we looked at with the frame data of the neutral R2, right, the charged portion, is that it has guard frames on the startup, you know, not immediate startup, but about, you know, very early, 7 frames in. So if we look at the two-handed R2 real quick here, that looks to be very accurate, okay? So, once again, guard frames on frame 5 starting up, and the deviation and difference between the hold from the character here, the normal block being a direct vertical, and then they hold down the R2 button, and that is where the frame 5, you know, startup of the block frames actually activates, and then potentially, you know, all the way up until the release window, obviously, and we'll get to that later, and we'll kind of reassess this to better understand it. But I think what we're seeing right here, when they cock the shield, you know, to the facing like the top left there, you know, kind of like Kitty Wampus, dude, you know, diagonally, it's more than likely what we're seeing right there. So I wanted to point that out too. And unfortunately, we do see this animation being canceled because before they can actually get into the rest of the R2 animation. And it would have been so cool to actually see what that animation ends up looking like, right? Because if you just stand still there with that charged R2, it's even more of a reinforcing factor that you're just gonna fucking just lunge forward at somebody after, you know, the charge window. So that's really, really cool and really, really exciting, right? So there's that. But once again, I got a little bit sidetracked there, but what we're really looking at here is the two-handed neutral R1 and it being a thrusting based attack that kind of like pulls back, and then the guard frames kick in the recovery there where you're blocking, right? So that's really, really cool. But yeah, just kind of assessing this, right? The two-handed neutral R1, if you guys thought the design of the one-handed moveset was crazy enough already, we actually see that not only does this weapon with the two-handed moveset retain its guard recovery, right? But it also has frame 10 hyper armor activation that takes you through from frame 10, right? So you'll be uninterruptible by most things during these hyper armor frames. The hyper armor frames, like, they keep you, you know, like uninterruptible until you get to the active guard frames, which once again, this is a large discrepancy when compared to the one-handed neutral R1. See, in the one-handed neutral R1, we actually see the attack frames coming out 2 frames faster, you know, than the guard frames. And the guard frames actually kick in during the last active attack frame of the hitbox itself, right? So, but that's completely different here with the two-handed R1, because hyper armor takes you from frame 10 all the way to frame 31, which they might end up cutting this off, it's hard to say, so take that with a grain of salt, right? But this will take you into the guard frames, and the guard frames actually activate 1 frame before the active attack frames kick in, dude. So you're going to be blocking in tandem with when the active attack frames are actually coming out and hitting your opponent. And these guard frames are retained all the way into the move recovery and into the dodge recovery as well. And once again, you retain, and if this is a thrust, as we're seeing right here, which seems very, very likely, you know, we're seeing this thrust right here, and if those hyper armor frames and guard frames are accurate there, that's crazy, dude. You're going to be able to counter hit people while in damage reduction hyper armor, 8%, so you're taking 8% less damage up front, and the guard is kicking in before the active attack frames actually come out, and then you're going to be counter hitting people while you're taking very, very little damage because they have to go through your guard damage reduction. So whatever kind of damage reduction this shield has, it's tough to say, but it's probably going to be weak to, I would imagine, certain like elemental based damages, right? So there's that. But dude, this is absolutely crazy. And when I saw this, I was like, there's no conceivable way they give this weapon hyper armor in tandem with the guarding property in its recovery. And it's not even considered recovery either if it activates before the active attack frames come out and retains it too. Like that's crazy, dude, you know? So this is I'm at a loss for words, dude. I'm speechless with this design. So, and now's probably a really good time to bring up that before everybody like starts freaking out about this, right? One of the main drawbacks that's going to make this weapon either extremely good, or it's going to be extremely bad, okay? And the reason why I say that, and I think that there's very, very little room for like an in-between where it's just kind of mediocre, is that, once again, From Software, in some of their previous patches, I forget exactly which, but great shields were always a problem, you know, ever since the release of Elden Ring. And granted, they still are in a lot of ways, you know, extremely problematic with the incredibly high stability that they have, right? So what From Software did, right, is instead of just nerfing the problem outright, that being Great Shield's absurdly high stability, first, what they did was they made the Great Shield Talisman, the one that increases stability on whatever you're blocking with, whether it be a two-handed weapon, small shield, medium shield, or Great Shield, right? They nerfed the Great Shield Talisman and reduced its effectiveness with Great Shield specifically, right? So, you know, they took more of like a lax approach there, and they buffed the bonus that the Great Shield Talisman gives small and medium and weapon blocking, right? So that's how it currently works, and that was their first pass, right? So they reduced the effectiveness with Great Shields with the Great Shield Talisman, the effect that it had on them initially, okay? And then going on from there, what they did was, instead of actually nerfing Great Shields outright, because Great Shields were the problem, you know what I mean? They just were. And they should have directly nerfed Great Shields, even beyond the reduction in effectiveness from the Great Shield Talisman. But instead, unfortunately, what they did is From Software's kind of holistic balance approach to Elden Ring in particular, and I usually praise them for this, you know, and I appreciate the approach that they've taken to the to just game balance in general thus far, you know, kind of taking the things that are underperforming and bringing them up instead of just outright nerfing the things that are overperforming, right, to kind of get that balancing factor, right? But in this specific circumstance, that holistic approach to game balance actually backfired. And what they did was they made literally everything that exists in the game, spells, incantations, every single weapons, all of its attacks, all of that. They increased the amount of stamina damage that everything in the game did by a significant portion. I don't know the exact value, but they increased the amount of stamina damage that everything did by a massive, massive portion, okay? And unfortunately, what that resulted in was it still didn't fix the Great Shield problem, and it just made medium shields and small shields and weapon blocking completely obsolete, okay? Like, to the point where you literally can't do it unless you're on like a 40 plus endurance build, right, with those respective things, okay? And, you know, like the greatest example that I can give in relation to this is, of course, the, you know, like the Starfist R2 with the Great Hammer Talisman that increases your stamina damage that you do to blocking opponents by 30%, okay? So if you have somebody with a Starfist R2, you know, where it hits with both weapons in tandem, two-handed, and they're running the Hammer Talisman, what they can do is walk up to somebody using a medium shield, for example, or a small shield that even has like 50 endurance, and they're stacking the Viridian Amber Medallion, the Viridian Medallion, which increases your, you know, your overall max stamina pool, like Green Turtle Talisman, Great Shield Talisman, etc. And they will be able to break your full stamina bar in just one attack, okay? So that's the current situation of how bad blocking with anything that's not a Great Shield is currently in the game, right? And that just feels so bad, right? Having their From Software's holistic approach to balance that has worked extremely well up until this point just massively backfire, you know, because that's a situation where they should have just pruned the outlier, right? That being the Fingerprint Stone Shield and Great Shields respectively across the board, right? Because the stability was just much too high, you know? And now, unfortunately, we're stuck with a system where, and once again, I do want to preface this by saying, From Software did since actually reduce the overall stability of Fingerprint Stone Shield and some of the other extremely high stability Great Shields, even after they did that. So not only did they try everything up until that point, you know, to reduce the effectiveness of Great Shields, right? But then after they increased the stamina damage that everything else in the game did, they caved effectively and just did the change that they should have done first, right? And that feels incredibly bad, because now we're in a state where, you know, like medium shields, weapon blocking, and small shields literally just don't exist, because like one running attack from like a light weapon can just absolutely decimate even 40 endurance, you know, like I just, it's unfortunate, right? So the reason why I go into that rant and bring all of that up right now is directly as a result of talking about the Dueling Shield in its entirety, okay? So being that I laid the groundwork for all of that, and the reasoning why I say that the Dueling Shield is either going to be extremely good or extremely bad. And hopefully you guys get a better understanding of why I, you know, it's between those two extremes, because of all of the stamina-based changes that From Software made. If the Dueling Shield doesn't have at least like the low 70s for stability, it's going to be like damn near unusable, because you're just going to get hit once, and even though you can't get guard broken, right, like we talked about with the disable block stun, and you won't get pushback, it still means that you're going to go into negative stamina, and then you're not going to be able to perform any action after, you know, like blocking an attack with the guard recovery or something like that, right? You're just going to be a sitting duck, and you're not going to be able to perform any action because you're in 10 miles of negative stamina, you know what I mean? So, and in a lot of ways that can end up being worse than getting guard broken, because especially with the high damage setups, certain power stance setups, things like that, it's going to result in you literally eating like a full L1 chain, and then you're just dead, right? So I really, really do hope that the Dueling Shield is at least like low 70s, but ideally it should be around like the 76 to 78 stability range, because if it doesn't have that, then it's literally like it's so rough, dude, you know, and you're really not going to be able to make use of the unique properties of the guard and the recovery and the startup frames of certain animations. So with that being said, I really, really do hope that From puts the stability where it needs to be to actually be usable, unless From Software reverts the stamina damage change that they did to combat Great Shields in the first place, now that Great Shields actually did get nerfed the way that they should have just done outright immediately, right? So with all that being said, I hope that From Software makes the right decision in terms of the stability for this thing, but that's something to keep in mind with this weapon. Even if you are incredibly hyped for it, just keep in mind that, you know, it could end up being almost unusable in a competitive setting, you know what I mean? Or just against certain weapons that just have way too high of a stamina damage multiplier tied to them. So, yeah, that's my rant on that front, but I feel like I needed to take the time to actually help everyone understand where I was coming from when I did say that, right? Because I don't want to be a doomer in relation to this weapon. In fact, I want to propose the exact opposite of that. You know, I want to be incredibly hype about everything that we're talking about in these videos, but it's something to keep in mind. But once again, like we talked about with the hyper armor startup frames and the guard block frames activating before even the active attack frames come out, it's like that could be a balancing factor too, you know, making it actually have relatively low stability, all things considered, but it can't be too low in the current state of the game, otherwise it will literally just be unusable. So ideally you want to strike a proper middle ground between things, right? So with that being said, we can move on to the follow-ups in the two-handed R1 chain, which start to get very, very interesting too, okay? So already you start to see a slight discrepancy, right? You know, spot the difference, right? And where that is right here. And this is a very similar kind of pattern that we saw with the one-handed neutral R1 chain, specifically the follow-ups, and then they would alter it, right? But now you have hyper armor thrown into the mix, okay? And one small discrepancy too is the hyper armor startup is 1 frame difference here. I believe it's about the same in terms of where the guard frames kick in afterward, but it's actually the guard frames are a little bit slower here. I believe the guard frames are 2 frames faster here, maybe? Because it activates in relation to the active frames, and this actually activates 1 frame after the first active hitbox frame, and right here in the first R1 it activates 1 frame before the first active hitbox frame. So small discrepancies there, but the biggest thing to keep in mind is, once again, the immediate 1 through 4 startup guard frames to have kind of a pseudo parry, once again, like I mentioned earlier in the video, right? So that's really interesting too. So it's like if somebody runs in on you, you know, trying to punish your rollout or something, and then you properly time the follow-up guard frames, once again, you got maybe a counter hit situation going on your hands, you know, on the side of the receiving end of the opponent there, right? So moving on from that, we do have, once again, R1 number 3, and we see a very similar situation, but with 1 more active frame of the startup guard. So, you know, once again, another pseudo parry situation there, right? One thing that's worth pointing out too is that the neutral R1 is frame 18, so it's completely reactable. This is along the lines of like colossal R1 speed, you know, in the game's current iteration. That's about the same speed that we're seeing, just to give you guys a better idea as to like how quick this attack is. But then on the follow-up R1, it's 1 frame faster, and same thing with the R1 number 3, which is very, very cool as well. And then once again, we do have a small and slight deviation here, and more so too, instead of like an alternating pattern like we saw with the one-handed R1 chain, where it was like, you know, front-loaded, back-loaded, front-loaded, back-loaded, and then the 4th one, you know, was very much just a combination of the two. We're actually seeing more of a natural kind of progression here with the two-handed R1 subsequent chain attacks here too. So it's like, it's very much the same, but every single time you get an additional frame of guard all the way up to guard frame 6, and obviously starting at 4, ending at 6 for the chain finisher there, which is very, very cool. And once again, R1 number 4, as is tradition, is a little bit slower because it's the heaviest part of the respective chain. So that's really, really cool as well. We do, I believe, have the two-handed running R1 here, 2, and frame 13 hyper armor startup, which is very slow. Okay, I want to put that into perspective too, because From is usually very good about their hyper armor activation on running attacks. It's just for like neutral attacks that it's like way faster than it should be oftentimes, and you can kind of use like frame 10 in relation to hyper armor as pretty baseline. Like that's kind of what you want to shoot for. So anything after that is a little more on the slow side. If it's anything below that, it's like fucking egregious, you know what I mean? So there's that, right? So kind of baseline, a little bit on the slower side activation wise for the hyper armor, which is good to see, you know, starting on frame 13 and leading you all the way up until your first active frame of your hitbox there, which is on frame 20, and that is a very, very slow running R1, right? And the two-handed moveset is much slower than the one-handed equivalent, right? So like if you just compare the two-handed neutral R1 as opposed to the one-handed is 2 frames faster than the two-handed is, right? So that's definitely worth noting and keeping an eye on as well. And then reoccurring theme, as we saw in the one-handed moveset primarily, is the activation of guard frames in the latter half of the active hitbox frames there. So that's really cool to see too. And once again, a frame 20 attack indicates that there's going to be a lot of forward momentum tied to this. There's a lot of like run up and start up, you know, distance covered maybe, right? And obviously this is very equivalent to what we discussed with the one-handed moveset, you know, kind of just a dynamic where both the running R1 and the running R2 are so different in terms of setup, right? But they do kind of mirror their one-handed equivalents here. But looking at the two-handed running R2, the most interesting parts about it, I would say, are, once again, the guard frame startup immediately, right? And they last for quite a while, but the added benefit here, as opposed to the one-handed running R2, is that you have hyper armor to take you through after the guard frames end, right? So if you look at the one-handed, it's like, this is really nice having this front-loaded here to protect you while you're like presumably holding this up, sprinting at them, and then you let it down and then you jump at them. So the only downside with the one-handed running R2 is that they can potentially just sit there and watch you run at them, you know, and then just as soon as your guard frames are let down, they just, you know, they just attack you and interrupt you out of this attack. But obviously with the two-handed variant, you don't have to worry about that as much because you have hyper armor to take you through this this period where you don't have the guard frames active, which once again, I really like that dynamic and the immense amount of difference and use cases between the two-handed running R1 and the two-handed running R2. I really, really do love to see that. So moving on from that, I do believe we can take a look at the two-handed rolling R1, which is only 1 frame slower than the one-handed rolling R1, which is very cool. And once again, if you compare that with the two-handed neutral R1 being frame 18, this is, of course, frame 16. So you have a 2-frame faster attack with crouch blending and hyper armor activation around frame 10, which is, you know, pretty standard and pretty in line. So that's really cool too. And of course, we see the guard frames kicking in as per usual, well into the recoveries respectively there. So that's going to be a really nice mix-up option for the two-handed moveset, right? And then this one's interesting too, because this is probably the biggest discrepancy between the one and two-handed movesets in terms of design. So like we see the one-handed backstep R1, right? And it has 2 like portions and sets of guard frames, right? You have one on the startup, and then you have one lasting well into the recovery. But with this one, you kind of forego that. The two-handed one doesn't actually have the like very, very fast guard, which kind of is unfortunate, but it does make sense if you know, work into what I brought up earlier with the fact that you are going to be able to have you're going to be able to hold L1 and backstep at the same time, right, to kind of get that coverage, and then you have frame 11 hyper armor startup to take you into the rest of the attack. So that's not too bad, but I would have liked to have seen, you know, kind of a similar setup in terms of the guard frames. But once again, all of this is subject to change, so we might end up seeing a similar design for the two-handed backstep R1 that exists within the one-handed backstep R1. So that being said, let's go into the two-handed R2s. So we got the charged R2 window here, which this is awesome, dude. Okay, like what we looked at with the charged frame data of the one-handed moveset was absolutely incredible, right? But we have the two-handed charged, and of course we'll look at the charged first, right, to get a better idea as to the release window as well. We have guard on frame 5, which as I was mentioning here, after the neutral R1 that we see right here, it looks like, he blocks the attack with the neutral L or the L1 hold, and then you see him charging it up, right? So if I had to guess, once again, I think what we're seeing is the startup of the fully charged R2, and that would make sense because holding it in front of himself, kind of cockeyed like that, the block frames beginning, which is what we're seeing right here, start on frame 5, which is really, really fast, last all the way up into frame 36, and then immediately, almost immediately after the or at the end of the release to uncharged window, and that's what we see right here, there's a actually there's no, wow, that's crazy. There's literally no vulnerability going into the release window, dude, because it's covered by 4 frames of guard immediately, and then at the same frame that well, even before the guard frames end, the hyper armor kicks in and takes you into the rest of the or the actual attack hitbox itself, which is so so cool, dude. Like, the two-handed R2 is going to be a monster in terms of like outplayability in mind games, dude. I absolutely love it. And then the two-handed charged R2 window, pretty standard, all things considered, just that the hyper armor starts very early, right? And we'll look at the two-handed R2, second R2 release window, and look at what that looks like too. So you don't have any guard overlap here on the release window, but you do have full hyper armor frames. And that's frame 1, dude, on the two-handed release window. So you're just going to be able to force trade hardcore with the follow-up two-handed R2, which, once again, there's so much happening here. And I'm so excited, dude. So that's kind of how the two-handed R2 functions there. And we do have, once again, as I was mentioning earlier, we have confirmation of Barbaric Roar and Warcry being attunable to this weapon. Once again, reinforcing and cementing the idea that this weapon does have an unlocked Ash, which is so cool. And this is, I kind of wanted to look at this. Okay, so the two-handed guard counter doesn't actually have guard frames on startup, which I was kind of surprised by. But at the same time, though, like, you guys got to keep this in mind in relation to a guard counter, because if a guard counter had block frames on startup, it would like trivialize PvE, because guard counters are already so good in PvE in terms of stance damage and stance breaks, you know, that if you had guard frames, even if it was only like one guard frame, you know, like, you would be able to just throw this out during like flurry based attacks and be completely fine. So when you think about it from that perspective, however cool it would be to have block frames on the startup of a guard counter, that's the whole reason why even the Dueling Shield doesn't, I would imagine. But it does have hyper armor, but it is very delayed hyper armor. And I wish that the hyper armor would activate a lot quicker, honestly, on the vast majority of two-handed block-based weapons and stuff like that. I think that would be a cool addition, but that is a discussion for another day, of course. So that is the two-handed guard counter, which is quite cool. It's a little bit on the slower side, hitting on frame 24, but that does make sense, you know, all things considered. So moving on to the two-handed jumping R1, I do believe. So this is a massive discrepancy in terms of speed, right? Because the one-handed jumping R1 was actually frame 13, which is extremely good for a jumping attack, especially on a dueling shield, dude. I'm really fascinated to see what that animation is going to look like. But the two-handed jumping R1 is more similar in speed to actually the one-handed jumping R2. The one-handed jumping R2 was actually faster than the two-handed jumping R1 by, I believe, 2 frames there. So, but once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a bad attack by any means. It could have a lot of like range tied to it too. You know, you just line up that, you know, like one of the spikes on the edge, dude, and you just dive towards them. Or I could see this, you know, like the two-handed jumping R2. I know how we haven't got to that yet, but I could see that being similar to like a two-handed jumping R2 from like a twin blade, right, for example. So but maybe you thrust the pointy end, dude, straight towards them. You know, you kind of hold that straight out at them with the two-handed jumping R1, in which case, if it does have a lot of range, how slow it is doesn't really, you know, matter, right? You're still going to be able to clip people when, you know, on their breakaway spacing attempts, things like that, right? So there's that, and we'll take a look at the two-handed jumping R2 here. And what's interesting is that the two-handed jumping R2 actually does have hyper armor, but it's relatively slow hyper armor activation. It's not too slow, all things considered, but definitely a lot slower than some of the hyper armor activation that we've seen within the rest of the moveset thus far. And they're usually pretty lax about where the hyper armor activation actually starts up on, you know, jumping attacks in particular. So I'm honestly glad to see that a little bit more in line with where hyper armor activation should be across the board, right? And once again, the jumping R2, fascinatingly enough, is actually equivalent in speed to the two-handed jumping R1, which is very, very interesting. Oh, did I actually miss that, dude? Oh yeah, wow, okay. I totally missed that the two-handed jumping R1 actually had hyper armor on it as well. So that is actually crazy in terms of that. So using the jumping attacks to, like, you know, like a late jumping attack to actually force trade is a very real possibility with this weapon too. So the unlock, jump away, and, you know, lock on turnaround jumping attacks with this thing are going to be really, really cool to play around with. And we are nearing the end, unfortunately, because I could genuinely talk about this weapon this weapon type for hours on end, dude. But I know the video is running a little bit long here in comparison to the rest of the parts in the series, but as I'm sure all of you guys understand, there's a lot more fascinating elements to talk about when it comes to the Dueling Shield in particular, with the functionality that it shares. But moving on to the last thing that we'll end up talking about here, I do believe, is that we look at the offhand moveset, because here we see it actually has a completely unique offhand moveset, which is really, really weird, right? So, and once again, I would take this with a grain of salt too, because here's where we start getting into a lot of the unfinished portions of the moveset. So definitely take the offhand moveset with a grain of salt here, but as it stands right now, it does have a completely separate moveset from its neutral R1s, which seem to be a lot worse. They don't have guard frames tied to them. They are 4 frames slower than the neutral R1, respectively, here, and have a hell of a lot more recovery too. So maybe this is just like mirroring the baseline, like, great shield frame data that we have currently in the game now. Maybe they put that in as a placeholder, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't triple checked that. But yeah, it's just kind of worth bringing up and worth noting that the offhand moveset is very unfinished, and I wouldn't read too much into this discrepancy. And unfortunately, and once again, I do want to preface this by saying that this still could very well be a potentiality, but as it stands right now, in the frame data, there is no power stanced moveset for this weapon, which I was very disappointed to, you know, like, find out when I was looking through this. But once again, that does not mean that FromSoft couldn't potentially make a power stance moveset with these weapon types, with the Dueling Shield in particular. But as it stands from the frame data analysis portion, we don't have a unique power stance moveset, or a power stance moveset at all, tied to this weapon. But I do believe that rounds out the part 4 of the frame data analysis for the DLC weapon types. And of course, there is only one more frame data set to go, and of course I will be covering that in part 5. And it's looking like, from my analysis, that A058 up here, that frame data set, is very much in line with the martial arts based weapons that we saw in the recent gameplay footage that Bandai Namco provided for the content creators that got to play, right? So definitely look forward to the next part, and I do believe that is everything. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it, as always. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like and or subscribe to the old Frostman. And above both of those, I would really, really appreciate it if you guys could share this with any homies that you think would be interested in what we're covering here. So with that being said, bye for now, my friends. Until next time, later.